Well, good morning and welcome to the panel on religion and the presidency of George W. Bush. Sorry about that. I'm Fred Beuttler from the University of Illinois at Chicago. In a very real sense, religion made George Bush. Without his Christian faith, he never would have been able to run for the presidency, and he never would have become president. His is the only presidency where religion can perhaps be said to have made that president. Clearly, he would not have been re-elected to a second term without his own faith and the votes of many who voted for him because of that faith. In reflecting upon the 2004 campaign, I would suggest that one of the most bizarre statements in the whole campaign came from Senator John Edwards, who said he was, quote, very, very careful not to allow his faith to guide his policies. Notice that, very, very careful not to allow his faith to guide his policies. Now, one can perhaps understand John Kerry in that because the Roman Catholic hierarchy came out against a couple of his more public positions, although I'm sure that if Kerry had embraced the Pope's opposition to the Iraq War, he would have picked up a few votes. But Edwards' statement, I would argue, is significantly more telling because John Edwards was a Southern Baptist who chose to become a United Methodist. That denomination's public policy positions are in agreement with virtually every one of Edwards' policies. Why then did he say that he was very careful not to allow his faith to guide his policies? This points to perhaps the center of the most profound divide in America, the culture divide over religion and politics. A very large number of the people in this country want a politician whose faith does guide his policies. Isn't that one of the things that faith is supposed to do? For one's faith not to guide one's policies suggests that both are rather thin. There have been at least 3 major biographies of President Bush published in the last couple of years who've looked at his faith, in addition to numerous articles in the press. Many of the articles are from secular journalists, in some ways by clueless urbanites who are surprised to discover yet again that the majority of the American people really want their religious faith to guide their political positions. To those secularists, though, that's what really is the matter with Kansas. Religion, I would argue, is the center of the cultural divide. Clearly, President Bush has been deeply influenced by his religious faith. His is a moderate faith, humble and compassionate, although not all that reflective. He's not a preacher. The centerpiece, though, of his Christian faith is his understanding of freedom. My faith frees me, he wrote, frees me to put the problems of the moment in proper perspective, frees me to make decisions that others might not like, frees me to try to do the right thing, even though it may not poll well. Freedom is that watchword of his faith. In foreign policy, the centerpiece, at least as he describes it, is the expansion of freedom. As he said in speech in October, freedom is on the march in the world, and I believe mothers and fathers want to raise their children in a free and peaceful world. I believe all these things because freedom is not America's gift to the world. Freedom is the Almighty God's gift to each man and woman in this world. His domestic policies also flow from the same drive toward the expansion of freedom and a vision of an ownership society where property is not seen as theft, but rather as freedom, because it's the basis of independence. His faith-based initiatives are in part a change from a traditional conservatism, which under Ronald Reagan sought to shrink government programs. The statist dynamic would not allow that, however, so President Bush has sought to harness the armies of compassion through empowering faith-based programs. During the campaign, Senator Kerry focused on this as a breach in the separation of church and state. But President Bush was very clear on this. Quote, I fully understand it's important to maintain that separation. We don't want the state to become the church, nor do we want the church to become the state. Bush is proposing faith-based initiatives as a way to keep the state from becoming the church or to usurping its role. Quote, there's a way to accomplish the separation of church and state, he said, and at the same time to accomplish the social objective of having America become a more hopeful place and a loving place. While government is very effective in acquiring and distributing resources, it cannot love. As Bush said, I believe we ought to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's manifested in public policy through the faith-based initiative, where we unleash those armies of compassion. to help heal people who hurt. I believe that God wants everyone to be free, and that's what I believe, as President Bush said recently. It is precisely that faith in a God-given freedom that seems to scare a large minority of the American people. What is the religious faith of George Bush, and how does this influence his policy positions? That is the main agenda for this panel this morning. Our first presentation will be by Clyde Wilcox and Carin Larson of Georgetown University, who will give an overview of religion in the Bush presidency. This will be followed by a presentation by Kevin Dulk of Grand Valley State University, who will look at evangelicals and U.S. foreign policy. One of Bush's central domestic policy agendas, the faith-based initiatives, is the subject of two presentations, one by Doug Koopman of Calvin College, and the second by Barbara Elliott on the effectiveness of faith-based initiatives. After a brief discussion by the panel and their presentations, I will open it up to questions from the audience for a brief question and answer period. As one has recently written, quote, "Whatever else the presidency of George W. Bush imprints on American history, it will at least have granted the nation an opportunity to rethink the role of religion in public life." So with that, I would introduce Professor Wilcox and Carin Larson for their presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a very interesting conference so far. I've enjoyed it a great deal. At first glance, it might seem that George Bush would be the easiest of all the cases of the presidents to do. People who are looking back all the way to Madison are trying to read things into speeches here or there, but certainly the volume of material about Bush is just is very, very daunting. But I think at some level this is a pretty tough case to really talk about. For one thing, Bush is only halfway through his presidency. We're going to learn a lot about the decision-making of the Bush presidency through the Kiss and Tell books that are going to be coming out after the cabinet shuffle. But more importantly, his second term remains in front of him. The Christian conservatives who I study in the Washington area are wildly enthusiastic about the possibilities they imagine in Bush's second term. Wendy Wright from Concerned Women for America says that Bush could not do the things we wanted him to do in his first term because he needed to be reelected. And now in the second term, for the first time in a really long time, we have a president and a vice president who do not want to be president in the next time. And so they're pretty enthusiastic about what he might do. Moreover, it's hard to study this because the material about Bush's religion and his presidency is always coming with a pretty heavy spin. You know, there is a heavy spin, as we've just heard from the liberal secular press, which often mischaracterize his faith. Trying to see him as a fanatical fundamentalist who thinks he has an earpiece in his ear that gets direct messages from God. But let's be honest, it's also spun by the Bush camp itself, who did use religion pretty strongly in this campaign. They used it in the 2000 primaries. They used it in the 2004 general election. Certainly true that Bush himself did not go to the Southern Baptist churches and make the kind of speeches that Clinton made, but the RNC did tons of mailings. There were, liaisons in particular churches. So this is a campaign that wanted to spend religion in its own way as well. And then finally, Bush himself is a very polarizing figure. His job approval rating in the survey right before the election was about 50%, but it was 80% among Republicans and 20% among Democrats, and that's the biggest gulf we've ever had. Now, luckily enough, Carin and I reflect that gulf because Carin cast an enthusiastic pro-family vote for Bush, and it's precisely because I have a family with young children in the Washington area that I'm so nervous about Bush's second term. When we go to actually writing the paper, we'll have to figure out ways to resolve the differences. Originally, I thought maybe I'd challenge her to arm wrestle when we had a difference, but then she's 25 years younger than I am and very strong, and so I'm thinking maybe that doesn't work. Maybe I need a trivia questions about 60s pop music or something like that, and maybe I could win that way. But what we're going to do is this. Carin's going to come up and talk about Bush's faith. It's heavily documented. You all know this, but it's important to get it out, I think. Then I'm going to come up and talk about Bush's presidential style, decision-making style, honesty in the presidency, and so forth. Then Carin will talk a little bit about the policies where we normally think of his presidency as being based on faith, abortion, marriage, and so forth. And then I'm going to talk about foreign policy at the end.
Well, for George W. Bush, his profession of faith is not rooted in his childhood, as was the case for Carter and Reagan and Clinton that we learned about earlier today. He grew up in the Episcopal Church, but attributes the spiritual turning point in his life to a conversation that he had with evangelist Arthur Blessitt in '84, and a later conversation in Maine with Billy Graham. In his autobiography, he says of his talk with Graham, "It was the beginning of a new walk, where I would recommit my heart to Jesus Christ. I was humbled to learn that God sent his son to die for a sinner like me." Here we see that he grasped the primary tenet of Christian theology, Christ's death as the means of salvation, and he presents it in such a way that really resonates with American evangelicalism today. Every time he recounts this experience, however, he does not use the term born again, a term that most evangelicals use when describing the point at which they accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Instead, he often recalls the presence of Graham, the man who lit a spark in his soul, planted a mustard seed. He uses phrases like renewal of personal faith or as a rededication. But nonetheless, it is this personal testimony of faith that has received such attention in recent years and could explain his great support from conservative Christians. It's widely known that Bush reads the Bible, he prays, he reads Oswald Chambers' My Utmost for Its Highest as a daily devotional. We know that Jesus is his favorite philosopher. It's these things that provide evidence that he has a personal faith, a daily walk with God. He turns to God as a regular source of strength. His former speechwriter, David Frum, in his memoir says, "Missed you at Bible study," were quite literally the very first words that he heard when entering the White House. I would argue, too, that Bush is especially shaped by the small group experience of evangelical Christianity. During his involvement in the Community Bible Study Fellowship in Midland, Texas, this was very solidified. He, in the small group experience, he can comfortably speak of his faith to a small group. He's used to sharing his faith with others, and that is contributed to why it's come across so sincere in the campaign. Bush credits his religion, his faith in God, with his ability to overcome his drinking habit. A second claim, which causes some controversy, his success in political office. In his autobiography, he writes, "I could not be governor if I did not believe in a divine plan that supersedes all human plans." After the 2000 election, he said, "There is only one reason why I am in the Oval Office and not in a bar. I found faith. I found God." It has been said that he told the Reverend James Robison that God wanted him to be president, that God called him to be president. And as Clyde mentioned, it's not as though he's hearing these audible voices in his head, but this is a typical refrain of evangelical Christians when they feel a peace at a place where God is leading them to. Bush believes in God's providence, that he is the primary source of direction in his life. That being said, we'd also like to point out that his beliefs, and as we'll discuss in a few minutes, his policy decisions have not always been as evangelical as we initially think. Here I use the term evangelical as it's often defined politically today. At the very least, we can say that his behavior does not suggest that he's a fundamentalist Christian. For instance, when he expressed his belief in the Bible during the 2000 campaign, he said, "From Scripture you can gain a lot of strength and solace and learn life's lessons. That's what I believe. I don't necessarily believe every single word is literally true." So while believing the Bible is the Word of God, he does not embrace biblical literalism as is done in the fundamentalist church. Moreover, just recently, when asked if Muslims and Christians worship the same God, Bush replied, "I think we do. We have different routes of getting to the Almighty. But I want you to understand, I don't get to decide who goes to heaven. The Almighty God decides who goes to heaven, and I am on my personal walk." Bush has joined in prayer with Hindus, Muslims. This is something most evangelical Christians would not do. Religious pluralism and tolerance has been especially important following 9/11, but even before 9/11, at the 2000 Republican Convention, Bush tied his stance on these issues to his beliefs. He said, "I believe in tolerance, not in spite of my faith, but because of it. I believe in a God who calls not to judge our neighbors, but to love them." Many of the recent books on Bush's faith have made the case that his religious beliefs are sincere, that they fall in line with evangelicals, but none of the authors they admitted to not finding it easy to summarize Bush's faith and his beliefs, per se. David Aikman, who's the author of A Man of Faith, said that he couldn't get from anybody a sort of credo of what Bush believes. A Washington Post headline reads, openly religious to a point. Bush leaves the specifics of his faith to speculation. Porter described his faith as a practical, instinctive faith, implying that it was very doctrinally rigorous. And indeed, Bush might readily admit to not design to outline the tenets of his faith, and you could make the argument that that would be very divisive, and he has chosen instead to make it as inclusive as possible. When he married Laura, he became a member of the Methodist Church and was asked one time what the differences were between the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church in which he grew up. He said, the Episcopal Church is very ritualistic, and it has a kind of repetition to the service. It's the same service, basically, different sermons, of course. The Methodist Church is lower key. We don't have the kneeling, and I'm sure there's some heavy doctrinal differences as well, which are not enough to explain to you. He is currently attending an Episcopal church in D.C., and remember, this is a denomination that welcomes gay couples, and when he goes back home to Texas, sends a message that is more friendly to pro-choice. So as we see that Bush believes in the presence of God, that he has a faith in Jesus, so deep relationship with God, foundation for his life, but not to be espousing a particular doctrine is in, and we're left with an unclear picture in that respect.
So his faith is misunderstood by most of those who are writing. One of the things to talk about is to what extent does his faith influence the way he makes it? We'll talk about the decisions he actually, but I'll talk about two things. First of all, it's often asserted that Bush has. Certainly he's made the right decision, often with making a very quick decision. And then secondly, the level of honesty. I want to quote here from Jim Piffner, who is, I think, the leading expert in the nation on potential characters written on this. It's written about George Bush. And Piffner is no liberal by any means. President Bush has shown a preference for moral certitude over strategic calculation, a tendency for visceral reaction rather than action, a action rather than deliberation, and a preference for the structural or he actually doesn't think these are all bad things, but I mean, at some level, what he said, Bush is someone who's very confident of the decisions he makes, and he makes those decisions very quickly and at some level, at a visceral level. And I think this is agreed by his supporters as well as his opponents, and people who've come from the administration have all talked about this. Condoleezza Rice will be the new Secretary of State, says, he very much does not want me to say this is complex. He wants me to say this is simple, here's the answer. Okay? Now this is like, say, Roosevelt Clinton, who see diverse points of view around it and listen to the debate. Apparently what Bush really likes to do is hear one point of view, rather quick decision. There's grumbling from cabinets that they feel that they should not be dissenting and so forth. A couple of highly publicized examples of this, which, you know, there are many others you could talk about, but not asking if he thought about going to for Colin Powell, arguably having a lot of experience in this particular thing. And then symbolically, the statement that was talked about last night, when asked whether he had talked about his own father, the God said that this is not who you turn for strength. Instead, he turned to the higher father. Now, certainly liberals and seculars criticize this notion that he would talk to the higher father. I don't think anyone probably is too worried about that, right? 2 points that are worth noting. First of all, that he's really asking for strength, not guidance. Right? He says, who do you turn for strength, as if the decision's already been made. But secondly, why not talk to your earthly father too? I mean, at some level, your earthly father is the one person in American history who's ever done this before, gone to war with Iraq, you know? And so he had a family relative, not talk to him at some level is striking. To pray is not at all striking, right? We would certainly hope a president would pray before that decision, but not to ask your earthly father is a little bit striking. And I think there is a pretty widespread idea that Bush doesn't like a lot of, dissent and wants to make a rather quick decision. Patton's quote, which, you probably all saw right before the election, summed it up best. I think he said, this is how he described Bush, as the most supremely confident man I have ever met. And then he used the metaphor, which doesn't resonate well from the evangelicals that I grew up with in West Virginia. He said, like a Christian holding 4 aces, you know. So, West Virginia, Christians weren't gambling, and so now it's commonly asserted then that his faith, usually misunderstood as being this fundamentalist faith, is the source of this moral certitude, and I think it is consistent with that. The notion that God leads you, and that there is a truth, and there is there's good and evil. The real question is that the causal source of that certitude. And this is kind of new for me, look into someone's soul and figure out where religion causes them to see things. But I'd just like to make 2 points. First of all, there's an awful lot of people who have very similar faiths who don't show that level of moral certitude. Jimmy Carter being a pretty clear case. Very similar faith at the core, right? But not the kind of person who, he sees a lot more shades of gray. Secondly, Bush's decision-making style appears to have been like this before he, accepted Christ also. So this appears to me to be a personal decision-making style of his. He trusts his instincts. He's someone who's got a little bit of confidence. He makes personalized kinds of decisions. And religion may reinforce that to a certain extent, but it wouldn't necessarily be causal. One of the interesting things that sort of played out in the campaign about this certitude was the question, have you ever made a mistake? And it was interesting how many times Bush refused to answer that question. But if you read, the books about his faith, he talks about his faith, he says often, I pray for forgiveness. So at least he's telling someone about the mistakes he's made if he's not telling the reporters. So the second area we want to talk about is honesty, and this is going to be a little controversial, but at one point Bush ran for president saying, I'm going to restore trust and honor to the White House. I'm going to bring more honesty to the White House. He was very critical for obvious reasons for the moral climate of the White House under Clinton. And so at some level, does he then have a more honest White House? Rather than trying to figure out between the two of us about particular cases, what we've done here is gone back to Jim Piffner again, who, like I said, is the expert in this stuff. He's written a wonderful paper about do presidents lie? And the answer to that, in short, is yes. And Piffner argues actually times we want them to lie, as Eisenhower with the U-2 incident and so forth. There are times when presidents have to, not be honest, and there's other times where they do it for really trivial reasons. Reagan repeated the welfare queen again and again after it had been pointed out to him several times that this was not true. But, it's kind of a trivial lie at some level. Where Piffner ends up putting Bush is sort of in the bottom half, but near the top of the bottom half. And this is not Lake Wobegon, where everyone's above average. So half are below average, half are above average, and so he's pretty close to the mean. In other words, not really standing out one way or another. The one thing that Piffner flags as something that was clearly dishonest, where Bush knew it would be dishonest, is I don't have the war plan on my desk. Now maybe he had war in his safe. We know the war plans had been drafted by then, and within the faith tradition of Bush, it would not be quite acceptable to say they're not on my desk. So there's other cases that he draws on and so forth, but he puts him sort of about the middle. I study campaign finance. I look a lot at how presidents reward their contributors. I think Bush rewards his contributors with special benefits as much as everyone else has done, but no more so. But it's worth noting one thing sort of on the positive side of the honesty, and that is we're 4 years into the presidency and there's no indictments. And that might seem like a low threshold, but we're talking about Reagan, and there would have been a lot of people indicted by now, and with Clinton the same sort of thing. So in modern times, typically quite a few people are in trouble by this time in the presidency. And Bush clearly picked deeply religious people for many of these positions. It's also true, of course, that his is the same party in Congress creates the investigation, these things. But in and no scandals is a pretty good record. So now Carin will start talking about public policy.
Many members of the Christian right that Clyde and I have interviewed over the past few years think that Bush is completely their guy. Clyde to say something a little different today, that Bush has by no means been a rubber stamp for Christian right policies, and in many cases his policy positions that they are most interested in have not been blanketed in religious terms. And again, this is contrary to many of the media reports that we see. On abortion, gay marriage, it seems clear that Bush is consistent with evangelical groups in politics. He reversed the Mexico policy, he appointed pro-life judges, pushed abstinence education, avoided the distribution of contraception in schools, but he's compromised on the stem cell research issue. He has prevented additional funding for new lines. And even on issues such as abortion, while being pro-life, he's not taken as specific issues as Christian conservatives would hope he would take. He uses the term of life, which really resonates with the Catholic communities, but he's never come out and said that he would reverse Roe v. Wade, which is most evangelicals would be hoping for. In the third presidential debate, when asked about abortion, he says, I think it's important to promote a culture of life. A society where counts and every person matters. I believe the ideal world is every child is protected in law and welcome to life. I understand there's great differences on this issue of abortion, but I believe reasonable people can come together, put good law in place that will help reduce the number of. Turning to the fight for traditional marriage, he endorsed the constitutional amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman, but this was after a long period of time of perhaps what could be described as reluctance. But he hasn't used the bully pulpit to push this amendment either, and in his defense of traditional marriage, he has framed it in terms of activist courts and not on biblical principles. He said, again in the third presidential debate, "I think it's very important that we protect marriage as an institution between a man and a woman. I proposed a constitutional amendment. The reason I did so is because I worry that activist judges are actually defining the definition of marriage." When asked if homosexuality was a choice, he said, "I don't know." Again, evangelicals would most likely say that it is a choice, that it is a sin. Again, he has not pushed these issues, and these are two of the most prominent issues on the Christian rights agenda. Faith initiative is probably the most visible and well-articulated application of his faith to the public sphere, but here we saw that that initiative floundered in Congress, and it no longer seems to be on the agenda, and I'll leave that to my colleagues to discuss that further. Bush also made a commitment to AIDS in Africa that received bipartisan support, obviously great intentions. He described this in terms of his faith. He said that God has called us into action for a responsibility to help a neighbor in need. But again, this was not followed through. So on this portion of the domestic front, we see a platform that coincides with typical evangelical political orientation. We don't see overwhelming energy and capital spent on this agenda. The way media tend to talk about Bush's may lead us to think that he is a rubber stamp for the Christian right, but we argue that that's not necessarily the case. Though you do have to say that Bush is probably the most president the evangelical groups have seen in quite some time.
One thing I'd add on the Africa AIDS policy is, of course, that some of that money is for abstinence-only programs. A third of the money that was actually allocated does go to abstinence-only programs. Well, finally, let me just finish up with foreign policy. During the election campaign, I had European journalists in my office pretty much every week trying to get me to say that somehow the Iraq War was part of Bush's fundamentalist eschatology, that he had this end-of-the-world scenario, sort of left behind kind of view of the world where he has to go to war with Iraq somehow in order to get Jesus to come again sometime soon. You know, that very clearly is nonsense. And Bush has never used that kind of language. It doesn't fit that kind of eschatology anyway, right? I mean, there's nothing about Iraq that would fit that. All the evidence I have is that Bush was actually originally unenthusiastic for the Iraq War when Cheney and the neocons were pushing it right after Bush was elected, before September 11th. It's fair to say, though, probably that Bush's faith led him to make the decision more quickly once September 11th happened. He does have a belief in the existence of evil, you know, the axis of evil and so forth, and that God wants people to be free. And so at some level, then, the difference between evil and freedom is a very sharp contrast that might have led him to disregard some of the evidence he was getting about how complicated the reconstruction of Iraqi society would actually be. But what I'd like to say here is that I think I see sort of moving forward two strands of religion popping up in the way he talks about foreign policy. And these are at some level not exactly contradictory, but not exactly complementary either. On the one hand, he says repeatedly, you know, that God wants people to be free. This is something Jimmy Carter would easily have said himself, right? And so this is, and this is clearly a very important belief to him. But he also believes that God has blessed America, that has endowed us with a special task, and that it's very important that America survive to be a beacon of hope to the rest of the world. That's a national security kind of issue. We have to stay, you know, secure. And it's not always consistent that we want the whole world to be free and we want ourselves to be secure, right? And at some level, then, these things tend to play out. And one of the best places, I think, of the contradiction there would be Uzbekistan. You know, not a headline kind of story, right, but clearly not a free regime. It's a regime that tortures its citizens, and we give them all kinds of money because they're a key partner in the war on terror. So at some level, you know, the sort of trade-off between these two has been played out in the administration. I think he firmly believes both of these things, and they're not always, you know, I don't mean to say they're inherently contradictory. On the world needs to be free. Well, one thing I've noticed is that this has not led necessarily to a follow-through in nation building in Afghanistan. You know, we topple the regime, they have an election, but there's whole portions of Afghanistan that are not really free right now, and there's not been a commitment of forces to sort of stabilize the situation and help spread this. But the huge debate in the foreign policy community in Washington now is which of these two takes priority moving forward. There's a lot of people saying that in the second term, the people have to be free part wins, in which case maybe there's a war in Iran, there's an aggressive effort to kind of, overthrow regimes and so forth. I think Condi Rice's appointment probably signals that's not the case, but I'm not entirely sure. Certainly moving forward, though, the second term of the Bush administration will be something that will really change the way we look at this. And so this is only a preliminary midterm assessment of the Bush presidency. This is the first time, like I've said, that we've had no one wanting to be the president, I think probably since the Truman administration. And so this is a totally unfettered administration with no hopes for electoral re-election. And so at some point then, the proof in the pudding for the Bush presidency will be the second term. Thank you.
Kevin, you're up.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I was a little worried that some of my thunder would be stolen by the discussion of foreign policy, and some of it was because I was not going to argue that Bush is driven by eschatology either in the war on terror or anything else for that matter. But in some ways, what I want to say is complementary. I'm going to be focusing especially on evangelicals, not so much on President Bush, but on how evangelicals have attempted to influence President Bush on international matters and the extent to which you might call evangelicals internationalists, which may sound strange to all of you, but I want to make the case that in fact they have at least become that if they weren't before. Just to start out, I want to think about evangelical internationalists in the context of the election. The election we just had. Commentators on that election have, of course, talked at great length about the importance, perhaps even how decisive values voters were in that election, and point to pieces of evidence like the passage of 11 initiatives, ballot initiatives focusing on same-sex marriage, for example, or survey data that seems to indicate moral values as crucially important. So pollsters, pundits combine those bits of evidence into a story of morality-based mobilization and voting behavior in that election. And evangelicals are often treated as exemplars of these values voters. Others are going to be talking about this. So I'm not going to spend much time on the matter of values voters, but those who do believe that values voters were decisive in the election tend to share an assumption that these voters, and particularly church-attending traditionalist evangelicals, were mobilized by domestic policy concerns, old standbys like abortion and decency, new issues like same-sex marriage. And that's a reasonable assumption. It appears to be where much evangelical energy was focused during President Bush's first term and the 2004 campaign. But my question is somewhat different. It's whether similar values-based concerns mobilized evangelicals during the first term to advance a foreign policy agenda, and if so, to what effect? And my general answer is that evangelicals, and particularly evangelical elites, did indeed pursue what you might call a moralist foreign policy agenda, and they did so fervently, and they did so with similar results as their domestic agenda, which is mixed, as we just heard. They also pursued these international concerns in a wider range of policy areas than journalists and social scientists typically recognize. These policy areas include some things that we're familiar with, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the war on terror. Those are two chief areas of concern for evangelicals, but also human rights abroad. It's somewhat of an unsung story, at least until recently. Alan Hertzky has a book, Freeing God's Children, on this issue. But human rights issues, especially religious freedom abroad, and global population issues, a whole cluster of issues dealing with global population, abortion, contraception, AIDS, other issues along those lines. And so these policy issues, though they're often interrelated, nevertheless present distinctive areas of evangelical international concern, and I want to use them as illustrations of evangelical involvement during the Bush presidency. And I want to think about them in the context of a series of assertions. And the assertion I want to start with is the following, and that is that evangelicals are emphatically not isolationists. In May 2002, New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof declared American evangelicals the new internationalists. And that discovery, and the way I read Kristof is that this was a discovery for him, seemed to take him by surprise. And he anticipated that many in his readership, and these are his words, those snooty, college-educated, bi-coastal elites, again, his words, would be skeptical of that claim as well. And his surprise may have been the result of an assumption that evangelicals are blinkered to the world, that they're contemptuous of it, and that they tend toward isolation. They are not among the college-educated bi-coastal elitists who read the New York Times about global issues and that sort of thing. Yet especially in responding to religious persecution overseas, Kristof and others have recognized that evangelicals have been taking the lead in combating global human rights abuses, and have been doing so well before George W. Bush took the oath of office in 2000. Evangelicals, for example, helped shepherd through Congress the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, as well as strong sanctions on nations that countenance sex trafficking in the year 2000. And in the second year of the Bush presidency, they successfully lobbied Congress to pass the Sudan Peace Act. These specific efforts were new for evangelicals, but to say that evangelicals were new internationalists reveals a lack of historical perspective, at least if one defines internationalists simply as an approach that takes seriously engagement with nations other than your own. Evangelical internationalism has ebbed and flowed over time. And today, and this is a remarkable statistic, I think, from the 2004 National Survey of Religion and Politics at the University of Akron. Among all identifiable religious groups, except Jews, evangelical Christians are the least likely, 34%, to say that the United States should mind its own business in global politics. And this view is particularly strong among those evangelicals who are most likely to attend religious services and intensely identify with the faith. What's more, again with the exception of Jewish Americans, white evangelicals are among the most likely to claim the United States ought to play a special role in the world, which is consistent with a history of looking at the United States as the city on the hill. There are many explanations for this support of global engagement, some of which I'll address later. One thing I do want to mention at this point as a partial explanation is the dramatic demographic shift in Christianity around the world, the global demographic shifts that we're seeing as a proportion of the global population of Christians. At least half as many Christians reside today in Europe and North America than in 1900. At least 60% of Christians today are non-Western, primarily in the Southern Hemisphere. In fact, one commentator puts that percentage as closer to 3/4 of Christians living in those areas. The change is so important that historian Philip Jenkins has taken to calling non-Western Christianity the next Christendom. And evangelicals, of course, have large numbers of missionaries in the field in these places. And they're exposed vicariously to social, economic deprivation of these Christians in their daily life, and aided by modern forms of mass communication. American evangelicals have become more sensitive to what they often call the suffering church abroad. So these demographic shifts are very important as an explanation of evangelical internationalism, but they're only part of the story, and that leads me to a second assertion, and that is that evangelical foreign policy engagement is generally guided by religious worldview, and increasingly so. Consider in the most general terms that evangelicals are significantly more likely than any other demographic or political group to say that moral principles ought to guide foreign policy. 86% say this, according to the 2004 Pew Forum survey. And the differences between evangelicals and other groups are significant enough to suggest that there is something distinctively religious, evangelical, that explains the variation. Of course, a religious approach, a worldview, focusing on foreign policy can take many different forms. So some evangelicals, for example, if we talk about policy in Israel, are driven by eschatology. They see the existence of Jews in Palestine as a sign of Christ's second coming. Others place less emphasis on end times theology, but still insist on a pro-Israel policy that reflects the biblical claim that, quote, God blesses those who bless the Jews. There's some diversity there, but in both instances driven by religious worldview. The context of international and particularly UN efforts to address population growth, evangelical pietism goes global in a sense. For example, as was mentioned, President Bush's $15 billion pledge to combat the global AIDS epidemic was met with demands by evangelicals to earmark a third of the funds for abstinence education. And so on. There are many other examples. But the key point here is that evangelicals have begun to pay closer theological attention to issues of international concern, and that suggests to me at least greater longevity in evangelical internationalism. So that's a second assertion. Third assertion, evangelicals have become increasingly sophisticated in terms of tactics as well as in terms of how they think about worldview. This is what we tend to find, in fact, in domestic politics as well, and there's no better illustration of this tactical sophistication than evangelicalism's willingness to engage in coalition building, which has been characteristic of just about every aspect of evangelical foreign policy engagement. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, has led to a number of very strange bedfellows, in particular between Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians in the establishment of organizations like Stand for Israel. Ralph Reed, the former executive director of the Christian Coalition, co-founded that organization. And it exists in order to encourage Christians to advocate on behalf of a pro-Israel policy. Well, that is a very interesting coalition focused on international affairs. Similar strange bedfellow coalitions have emerged in other areas of U.S. Foreign policy. Evangelicals have worked with the Vatican and, remarkably, Islamic countries on UN Population Fund initiatives. They have also worked with Jews and, equally, maybe even more remarkably, feminists on human rights issues, particularly religious freedom and sex trafficking. Alan Hertzky, incidentally, I mentioned his name a little while ago, has a great book on that very issue. The upshot here is that coalition building illustrates an overall willingness to suppress old animosities for common goals, and that's a real tactical asset. Now, to this point, I've been talking about evangelicals as a group, but my next assertion points to another key feature of evangelicalism, and that is that evangelicals often disagree. In other words, evangelicals are not monolithic on U.S. foreign policy, and there are some deep divisions. There is a popular tendency to see evangelicals, and not just popular, but journalistic tendency to see evangelicals in nearly conspiratorial terms, lined up in lockstep. And this isn't accurate in domestic politics, as we heard, and it certainly is not true in international politics either. The disagreements can come down to theology, they can come down to tactics, or both. There's a great deal of disagreement among evangelicals on Israel, for example, and whether policy ought to be largely pro-Israel, or as another group of prominent evangelicals have said, there should be a more balanced approach to the conflict between Israel and Palestinians. Similar disagreements emerged in the wake of 9/11 and the burgeoning war on terror. At least one media study, for example, suggests that while some evangelicals envision an emergent battle with Islam, and you might recall some of the provocative statements by some evangelical leaders in the wake of 9/11 about Islam, others seek to distinguish a retributive war or just war on international criminals from a clash of civilizations. So there's diversity here. In addition to being diverse on U.S. foreign policy, and this is my next assertion, relatively speaking, evangelicals do not yet have a mass movement on international issues. Put another way, the faith-based internationalist orientation of American evangelicals remains largely elite-driven, an elite-driven phenomenon. Now, that isn't to say that people at the grassroots aren't paying attention, but relative to domestic issues, the matters of foreign policy still tend to be driven largely by elites, and there's some evidence that I'd be happy to talk about in question and answer, taken from the way elites communicate to the mass, communicate to the grassroots. Not a whole lot of communication about foreign policy issues, a lot more about domestic issues like same-sex marriage and other things. One final assertion, and that is that evangelicals have an uneasy relationship with George W. Bush on foreign policy. And here, a little of my thunder was stolen. But let me just mention one thing, and that is just thinking about intellectual matters, competing conservatisms, and how that bears on foreign policy. And especially in the context of human rights issues, religious freedom around the world. On the one hand, there are a number of conservatives within the Bush administration that are economically focused. Economic conservatives worry that limits on trade, and those limits are very real if you start to place sanctions as a result of human rights abuses. If you worry, these worries that limits on trade will close off important markets, put American business at a disadvantage competitively in the global economy. So you've got that camp. You also have what you might call a realist camp of conservatives within the Bush administration, very skeptical of moralist demands. They fear these kinds of international impositions of human rights standards, for example, will upset international security, balance of power, very delicate. And then, of course, there are others who have been, under some circumstances, quite receptive. We've been calling them the neoconservatives, sometimes quite receptive to evangelicals, in part because one of the arguments of neoconservatives is to spread democracy. And the hope is that for many evangelicals that way of thinking about foreign policy will ultimately have some effects when it comes to human rights abuses and the like. Well, just a couple of things very briefly about, given all of these kinds of assertions, what I think is likely to happen in the future. One thing that I think is likely not to happen is a kind of isolationism among evangelicals, especially as they've begun to develop a kind of theological justification for doing what they do. There may also be a problem, though, that without mass mobilization, it's hard to imagine a huge impact, except in continued coalition. Keep building these kinds of coalitions. But those coalitions themselves are hard to maintain, especially with bedfellows who are so remarkably strange. How do you continue to maintain those coalitions into the future? A third aspect of the future, I think, is that the policy agenda will remain a stepchild of the domestic agenda. The foreign policy agenda will remain secondary. And that other issues, domestic issues, will, to mix metaphors here, will continue to sort of suck the wind out of the foreign policy initiatives. And I have a question that I'm pondering, and that is whether Bush's reelection really does open the door for evangelicals, or if, in fact, President Bush and the administration may look at this as an opportunity to strike out in other directions. But we can certainly have a nice conversation about that during question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Doug? Doug Koopman from Calvin College.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. I'll try to make my remarks a little bit shorter since Barbara and I are really talking about the same issue, President Bush's faith-based initiative and how that's fared in the first term, and some ideas about how it might go in the next 4 years, too. And I want to start with a quote from one of the presidential candidates in the year 2000 talking about how important faith-based initiatives would be to his administration. And he's talking at a Salvation Army center in Atlanta. Ordinary Americans have decided to confront the fact that our severest challenges are not just material, but spiritual. Americans know that the fundamental change we need will require not only new policies, but more importantly, a change of our hearts and our minds. For too long, national leaders have been trapped into a dead-end debate. As Mother Teresa put it, plant the act, reap the habits. Plant the habits, reap the virtue. Plant the virtue, reap the character. Plant the character, reap the destiny. I'm here today because I believe government should play a greater role in sustaining this quiet transformation, not only by dictating solutions from above, but by supporting the effective new policies that are rising up from below. Today I give you this pledge. If you elect me president, the voices of faith-based organizations will be integral to the policies set forth in my administration. Those are, of course, the words of Al Gore in 1999. They are. May 1999, Al Gore said those words. Two of my colleagues who wrote a book with me called Of Little Faith, we wanted to look at this faith-based issue precisely for, well, that was one reason. The faith-based initiative seemed a case of first impression almost in the year 2000. Most lawmakers had not heard of it on Capitol Hill. Most administrators of government programs had not been attuned to the debate either. Both candidate Gore and candidate Bush said that this is what they wanted to do. This was one of their most important domestic initiatives, was to include more strongly faith-based groups in the delivery of federal government social services. So we thought, looking at trying to figure out what one political science researcher needs to do is to publish, what should we study that might be an easy public policy question? Thinking about this in the fall of 2000 and the spring of 2001. Oh, why not faith-based initiatives? Everybody loves it. It didn't quite turn out that way, of course. President Bush got elected. The faith-based initiative became far more complicated and far more controversial than any of us thought probably possible that would happen in that term, in President Bush's first term. But now he is elected for 4 more years, and there's 4 more years probably of a history of faith-based initiatives to go. But it is a wonderful case study, first in the separation of powers. Depending on where you look in the executive branch, the faith-based initiative is either marked by failure or by success. Most of the former failures are quite public, but the latter successes seem mostly hidden. Depending upon which part of the political system you look at, this centerpiece of the president's compassionate conservative agenda and one of his 3 top domestic priorities either gained important new ground or failed miserably. And depending upon your view of the initiative and the men and women who supported it, those advances and retreats are cause for either great concern or great joy for the American political system and the place of religion in American public life. This uneven journey of the president's faith-based initiative in his election campaign in the 107th and 108th Congresses offer insight into larger issues of American government politics and public life as well. We looked at it in our book, and we just want to talk a little bit about that. One, it is the separation of powers issue, that a policy that can be a failure in one branch can be a success in another. Within the legislative branch, it was largely a policy failure. The Bush administration had 3 domestic priorities as they entered into office in 2001: education, tax reform, and the faith-based initiative. Certainly compared to education embodied in the No Child Left Behind Act that was enacted with bipartisan support, and although became a partisan issue in the 2004 campaign, certainly that has to be chalked up as a success. And tax reform, which was really a Republican-driven initiative, a traditional Republican coalition-driven initiative, was certainly successful on those terms as being pushed through the Congress rather quickly and embodying Republican ideas of what good tax policy is. But the faith-based initiative, it was intended in the campaign to bring people together, and during the administration, or the strategic decision-making about the legislative process at least, it was to some extent a strategy that was intended, or at least the result was, to divide people rather than bring them together. The faith-based story is also interesting in what it says about the media. The story in the media is that it's been a failure. Largely the story in the media has been a failure because the media has tended to focus on the legislative side of things and not on the administrative side. It's also an interesting story about the relative power of base, constituency groups of a political party, and potential interest groups that might be affiliated with a political party. In this case, the base groups, which I would call politically conservative and religiously orthodox groups, weren't as excited about the faith-based initiative as they were about other things in the Bush administration, and helped to derail to some extent the legislative path of the bill. It's also an interesting story about the power of personal presidential interest in an issue. President Bush seems to be the chief advocate of the faith-based initiatives, even within the White House organization. No one past or present really seems to be as interested in moving this forward as does the president himself. And certainly the power of unpredicted events in a nicely, carefully calibrated legislative strategy. What happens when unpredicted events happen? When Jim Jeffords moves from the Republican Party to caucusing with the Democrats, but as an independent. When September 11 moves all of the discussion away from domestic priorities to international priorities. So the faith-based initiative is a wonderful case study for that. And I just want to focus on one thing, since we're really talking about the, I think to some extent, many of the panelists have talked about what type of religion does President Bush have or hold, or what types of groups seem to be key in his policymaking process. I want to talk a little bit about the 2 sets of camps who organized around the faith-based initiative early on in President Bush's term. And then I want to finish up with a little bit of a few predictions about what I think will happen in the next 4 years around this issue. But supporters of faith-based initiatives in the 2000 campaign and before that time have really always been in 2 camps. And the ambiguity of the president's discussion about the faith-based initiative in the campaign and in his first steps at personnel selection seemed to emphasize that ambiguity. On the one side were the purists who wanted greater official support for orthodox religion in the public square. Some of these purists want government to give explicit preference to evangelical Protestant Christianity and to block fringe religious groups from receiving funds or from otherwise being on an equal playing field. When he was reviewing the faith-based initiative in some detail for the first time in February of 2001, religious broadcaster Pat Robertson called it appalling that the plan could result in government contracts for programs run by minority religions such as the Church of Scientology and the Unification Church. Now, he and other purists has always had mixed reactions to charitable choice, which is the precursor legislative language that had actually been in 4 pieces of law before President Bush came. into office. But they've always had mixed reactions to this, appreciating its implied endorsement of religious treatments for social ills, but worrying that government regulation might intrude upon them if they received the government funds. But because charitable choice really hadn't been implemented on any significant scale, there was little evidence of these feared impacts. But what the purists did want under Republican president was a faith-based initiative that clearly protected their right to operate programs in the way they thought their faith required. Few reporting requirements, full hiring discretion, freedom to operate programs directly part of or within churches. The purists also wanted a new government attitude toward religion, a neutral view that replaced what they thought was a prevailing anti-religious position. They wanted the government to fund entire programs, no matter how religious, as long as a secular alternative was available to complaining beneficiaries. They argued that only this freedom to be fully religious would keep a program to be effective, the very reason government was looking their way in the first place. Marvin Olasky was really the chief advocate of that, and he seemed worried that regulations contemplated in the first part of the Bush administration and on Capitol Hill would sap the vitality of religious social programs, much like welfare undermined individual initiative. And purists had made headway on the legislative front. The last charitable choice law was passed and then signed by President Clinton very late in 2000, a drug treatment law that had been written really to their liking, which in their view was the best charitable choice language that they had seen. Their most important claim was at least 4 conservative Supreme Court justices, Thomas, Rehnquist, Scalia, and Anthony Kennedy, but probably no more than them, would be with them if their version of charitable choice became law and was challenged in court. If President Bush had the opportunity to name 1 or 2 more justices, perhaps their view might even enjoy a majority. The other side, on the other side of the purists, are the pragmatists. This group agrees with the purists that religion should be more active in the public square, but they didn't really want to quite take it that far. They were not explicit preferentialists, looking for government to support religion generally or a particular form of government, but they were pluralists, happy if government agencies would be merely blind or ignorant of the religiosity of a provider, rather than hostile. If under President Bush's faith-based initiative, religious providers came to be preferred, well, so be it. But the government should choose which services to fund without regard to religion and more on the effectiveness of the program. Groups that might receive funds should compete on merit alone, on a level playing field. The pragmatists were also sensitive to arguments that government might appear to be endorsing religion by supporting a program that was closely integrated with faith treatment. In other words, a program that mixed whatever it was doing with an explicitly religious message. They were willing to separate government funds from private contributions and religious program elements from non-religious elements, the separability. That seemed okay for even pragmatists within the Bush administration. They were also willing to let beneficiaries opt out of religious elements of a program in which they otherwise participated. These more pragmatic conservatives, faith-based supporters, also made strong arguments for their view looking at the court. The swing vote in this and so many other cases is Sandra Day O'Connor, and she had been fairly clear in her position that the purist position was not hers, that she needed something more to ensure that government was not endorsing a particular faith tradition. And pragmatists had friends within the Republican Party, but their strongest support inside the system was actually only within the White House faith-based office and not really outside of the faith-based office. So there's this controversy among the faith-based supporters within the group of everyone who liked the idea of the faith-based initiative. On the one hand, let's use it as one tool in many to establish religion more strongly in the public square. By that meaning having government support slightly more explicitly, slightly more fully religious expressions. Versus let's have a neutrality, a true neutrality toward religion that supports religion and non-religion and doesn't support any particular religious faith with the confidence that over time religion will gain a larger position in the public square. And that really is the central controversy that has shaped what has happened in the three branches of government in Bush's first term on the faith-based initiative. The purists early on took control of the legislative strategy in the House of Representatives. It took them in that large environment that's largely, though, tightly controlled by the Republican leadership, took them 8 months to pass a bill that was very much to the purists' liking. This was in the late July 2001. The purists really got their kind of a piece of legislation through the House. It died there, and it remains dead. Part of the reason for that is that the Senate organizationally is entirely different than the House. And legislation of that type would never get through a Senate in which 60 votes are needed to really make anything happen. And by that time, the issue had become so partisan and the debate had become so divided between the two parties that there was no hope for any action in the Senate. What has happened legislatively is some funds for what's called compassionate capital funds, which are allowed to be tapped by any small group, religious or non-religious. But legislatively, not much really has happened. The other piece of legislation that was important to President Bush at the beginning was tax reform, to allow broader tax credits, tax deductions, tax preferences for charitable giving. That too has fallen by the wayside, although it doesn't appear to be entirely dead. Even now there's some discussion of passing a package like that in the lame duck as Congress that is meeting right now. That is probably not going to happen, but certainly the tax credit piece is a possibility. Judicially, the record is rather mixed. There are many federal court decisions dealing with the issues of church-state separation. Some that seem to directly impact the likelihood, success or failure of the faith-based initiative in the future, but few that you can really pin down and say, this is determinative about the future success or failure of court challenges to the faith-based initiative. The greatest success, again, is in the third branch, the executive branch. And it shows the power of presidential personal interest, the power of executive orders, and also the power of the executive branch agencies to do things under the radar of the media. There are satellite offices in several departments. There's a central White House office. And they have reviewed federal law and federal regulation and made changes to federal regulatory practices to invite faith-based groups to apply. They have taken funds and gone around the country for conferences, particularly targeting faith-based groups and inviting them and showing them how to apply for federal funds. The major success of the President's faith-based initiative has really been in what he has been able to do in the executive branch by executive order and by regulatory review. What's the future of faith-based initiatives? Well, I just want to make 4 or 5 very quick points. First, I would expect that there might be finally some tax legislation that makes charitable giving greater incentives for charitable giving, including giving for faith-based groups that do social services. 2, I think largely, though, the executive branch will continue to be very aggressive in continuing what it's done especially well in the last 2 years, is encouraging faith-based groups to apply, working within that subset of groups to encouraging them to apply. Third, I would expect that eventually the second Bush administration will try to codify in legislation what it is doing administratively. I might expect a fairly small legislative package, maybe in the second half of the President's term, to really to codify some of the executive orders that he has initiated on his own. And fourthly, I think faith-based initiative will affect judicial appointments. So much attention is focused, 1, on the potential Supreme Court appointments that President Bush might have, and 2, on what abortion, the impact of abortion on those issues. To me, equally, if not more important, is what will potential appointees rule on the separation of church and state, on questions related to these issues. That is important, or if not equally, if not greater important to President Bush, it seems, than their positions on abortions. And finally, we'll continue to see federal dollars going to faith-based organizations and probably a larger share of federal funds every year as long as the second Bush administration's in office. Thank you. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Barbara Elliott, who talks about faith-based initiatives and the effectiveness thereof.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to give my thanks to Gleaves Whitney for organizing this fine conference. The fact that we are even here to discuss faith in the American presidency is an important statement about the rightful place of faith in the public square. There are two truths that I'd like to focus on today in looking at the presidency of George W. Bush. One is that he is a pragmatic man, and the other is that he is very much a product of his Texas roots. And I'd like to focus on those two things in giving a little bit of a background of why we have ended up with a faith-based initiative and also what the successes were that he sought to emulate at a national level. Over the past 8 years, I have been on a journey that has taken me throughout the United States to visit homeless shelters, prisons, storefront churches, welfare to work programs for families that are making a transition, programs that have taken me to see immigrants learning entrepreneurial skills. And I've had an opportunity to see firsthand the people who are what the president calls the armies of compassion throughout the entire country. What I've discovered is a vibrant group of people who are doing the difficult job of loving broken human beings into wholeness. They are giving the least, the last of the lost, the tools to reclaim damaged lives, and they are healing people essentially with love. I call these people street saints. I have tracked probably more than 1,000 of them over the last several years. I've interviewed 300 of them for the research that went into my book, Street Saints, Renewing America's Cities, which essentially chronicles their successes, their best practices, the history of the role of faith in the country, and also a theology of compassion, looking at it from the perspective of what's happened just in the last few years. I've also worked with a number of these leaders through my own organization, the Center for Renewal in Houston. I've done capacity building and leadership training with the leaders of faith-based groups, not only in Texas, but also elsewhere in the country. I've collaborated with George Bush, initially when he was the governor in Texas, and more recently through the faith-based initiative. So I've been in and out of Washington on a regular basis, speaking in essence on behalf of those who are out in the trenches. And I have been out in the trenches with all the accompanying bruises to go with it. George Bush addressed a meeting this past June in Washington where he invited the faith-based leaders from throughout the country. We were all packed into the Washington Hilton ballroom, 3,000 people. I was on the program later in the day, but of course the event was the president appearing there. He entered to cheers from an enthusiastic crowd of people who were the street saints out in the trenches throughout the country. These were people who were Roman Catholic and Pentecostal and Baptists and Methodists. They were black, white, Hispanic, they were Asian. They had one thing in common, though, and that was their willingness to go and take their faith out into the streets of the cities where they were living. These are the foot soldiers in what the president calls the Army of Compassion. He said that day, "Amidst our prosperity, there is suffering. Where there is despair, we must work to provide hope and love. By healing addicts and feeding the hungry, you represent the genuine strength of the U.S." At this point, some of the crowd said, "Amen." He went on, "We receive tens of thousands of refugees who need help when they come here. We have teenage mothers and kids with parents in prison. We must utilize every resource we have." He went on to say, "Governments can hand out money, but cannot put love or purpose in a human heart. They cannot say, 'God loves you, and I love you too.' We can perform miracles. Our society is going to change from the bottom up, one heart at a time. We welcome the Army of Compassion." At this point, the audience interrupts him and says, "Preach it, brother." Others are saying, "Amen." He leans into the microphone at this point, throws away his notes, and proceeds to be utterly himself. And he was loving it as much as the crowd was. President Bush came into the Oval Office with a history of promoting faith-based initiatives. He had done so as the governor of Texas, and he had already seen their strength and had opened the doors for them to flourish in what they do. He recognized that people of faith are able to go deep enough to accomplish transforming change in the hearts of people. He had seen the spark that had reignited powers of renewal in blighted communities in his own state of Texas. He had met people like Kirby John Caldwell, for example. Kirby John Caldwell had grown up in Houston's 5th Ward, the son of a tailor. He had seen his father patiently sweep out the broken glass every time his tailor shop had been broken into. This is a neighborhood pocked with pool halls and prostitutes. Kirby John Caldwell got an education. He went to the Wheaton School of Economics, got an MBA, and breaking out of this impoverished background, ended up being a bond broker on Wall Street. He was well on his way to a 6-figure income, was driving a sleek gray sports car, until he got a call one afternoon at 2 o'clock. It wasn't a telephone call, it was a call essentially to go into the ministry. Now his family said, "You are insane, Kirby John, you've lost your mind." However, he did that. He got a theological education and then went back to the community that he had left. Now he took over a storefront church that had about maybe 24 stragglers on a given Sunday, and he has in the time since taken that over, as well as an abandoned Kmart, and now has turned that into a humming, buzzing, thriving center for essentially entrepreneurial enterprises. New people who want to start up businesses may. It's one of the largest catering and conference facilities in the city. He has begun to build houses, affordable homes for people who are in need of that kind of change in their life. They're finishing the 400th one shortly. He has created a variety of ministries and outreach initially through his congregation and through them into the community to deal with drug addiction, homelessness, broken families. He's created a clinic, a whole variety of things that are now pumping $17.5 million worth of business into the community every year. In addition to that, he has also created nearly 1,000 jobs. Now, when George Bush, as governor, visited Kirby John Caldwell's Power Center in Houston, it occurred to him that harnessing the energy of people of faith like Kirby John could spark renewal in other troubled communities around the country. It's not an accident that then Kirby John Caldwell became a friend of George Bush. He was there at the inauguration, and he has been called the president's pastor. George Bush wanted people like Kirby John to teach others to go and do likewise. And a part of his effort recently has been to encourage that learning process of other pastors who can plant power centers and things like that in their communities. George Bush also understands that faith is a potent factor in criminal rehabilitation. While he was the governor in Texas, he pioneered a program in partnership with Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship International. The Interchange Freedom Initiative in the state prison, which is west of Houston, was the first of its kind in the U.S. It's now been replicated in Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota. This 18 to 24-month program takes in volunteers from the prison and puts them into a separate wing of the prison, which is taken over by Prison Fellowship. Now, the people who go into this are then immersed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in faith. They study Scripture. They have a mentor, men from Christian churches nearby in Houston, where these people are going to be released when they come out. They deal with education as well, GED and ESL classes. They're teaching them job skills as well. But more importantly, they're getting to the root of their issue, which is, let's deal with honesty and forgiveness and restitution. They have put the prisoners face to face with victims of crime in a program that takes them through a series of conversations about what that change of heart would look like. Now, the interesting thing is that what's happened with this holistic approach to taking a prisoner is they are truly changing their hearts. These men are not committing crimes in the same rate that would ordinarily be the case. Prisoners who are released in America right now, and there are about 2 million of them behind bars, are more than 50% likely to end up behind bars again within the next 3 years. The recidivism rate for this group of people that have been tracked coming out of Interchange Freedom Initiative is about 10%. That's very significant when you realize that 200,000 people are going to get out every year, year after year, and unless something has happened to them to change their response, they will continue to commit crimes. Programs like this that take faith and take it deep enough to get to the root of their motivation are actually changing the hearts of these people, but also the sociological results of how they behave. This is an example that George Bush saw as governor as an appropriate intersection of the private and the public sector. The public sector provides the prison. The private sector provides the content for the program, which is fully voluntary and open to people of all faiths. The result is changed human lives that also have a civic value. Or let's take another example. One of the other tough social maladies we're facing is drug addiction in our country. When George Bush was the governor of Texas, he defended 2 faith-based drug treatment programs that had run afoul of the law as it existed there in Texas, Teen Challenge and Victory Fellowship. He came to the defense of these organizations, which did not receive any government funding. However, the local Texas Council of Alcohol and Drug Abuse, TCADA, had said, you must receive licensing from the state of Texas in order to continue doing business. And they both said, we protest. In fact, they took their protest to the Alamo. They actually had a rally at the Alamo. It's a great Texas tradition. Well, Governor Bush intervened on their behalf and said, no, these are separate faith-based organizations. They need not have this licensing in order to continue their business. Well, in doing so, George Bush was going out on a limb. He was defending a former heroin addict who had a very colorful past. Freddie Garcia had actually been on heroin for quite a number of years. Had a very colorful wife as well. She had driven the getaway car on their first date. He had been an addict for quite some time and had checked himself into a program in California called Teen Challenge. With the help of God, he found a way to a clean life, started a drug treatment program in San Antonio. He and his wife have helped more than 13,000 people leave drug addiction. Now, this was someone that George Bush knew about and said, regardless of what his past is, this man is changing lives. So he went to his defense. Now, this isn't just an isolated case. Teen Challenge is one of the few faith-based organizations that has had systematic sociological study over the last 30 years. When they claimed a 70% success rate back in the 70s, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare then said, no way. So they did a study and concluded actually it was an 83% success rate. They did a follow-up study then 12 years later to see what actually happens to the people when they leave the program and go back into normal life. The results were that 13 years later, 67% of those who had graduated were still free of alcohol and drugs. Yet another study on Teen Challenge was released in 1999, showed that 86% of those who had graduated from the program were still free of substance abuse. There are now centers of Teen Challenge all over the country, 250 of them in 67 nations throughout the world. These are the kinds of organizations that George Bush defended. Although they did not receive government funds, he understood that they were producing changed lives and they had a civic value. And he understood that the most important thing that the government could do was get out of the way and get the regulations off their back. Faith-based programs are producing changed lives. They're producing changed hearts, and through that, changed behavior. Research indicates that some of the most stubborn social maladies that have not responded to secular cures are responding to faith. And there's a reason to support their efforts. You see, every addict that does not go back to addiction has a civic value. Every prisoner who does not commit crimes again and go back to jail has a civic value. Every child who graduates from high school has a civic value. And George Bush understood that as governor and wanted to promote those results when he got to Washington. Now, he had a lot of sociological research backing up his assumption that these groups were producing good results. In fact, medical scientist David Larson pioneered the research on what he called the faith factor. They looked at addictions. They looked at a variety of juvenile delinquency issues. He, along with Byron Johnson, reviewed 400 different studies that had been done across the country. They honed in on 40 of them that examined faith as a particular variable. 3/4 of the studies revealed that religious participation results in less delinquency. They also concluded that attending a church or a synagogue on a regular basis, praying, studying scripture, the more often you do that, the less likely juvenile delinquency is, the less likely drug use is, and the less likely alcohol abuse is. George Bush realizes the power of the people of faith who are changing lives. So when he came to the White House, he wanted to promote the fruits of faith while keeping the government separate from inculcating faith. Do you see the distinction? You can provide a space for these activities to take place without necessarily providing the content yourself. He also had an intellectual component of what he was doing, and it came about largely through the friendship and the advice of Marvin Olasky. Marvin Olasky is in Austin. He is the editor of World Magazine and a professor there at the university. He is one of the people who had an influence on George Bush, became his advisor while he was in Texas, advised him through the first campaign. Now, Marvin Olasky wrote a wonderful book called The Tragedy of American Compassion. And in it, he goes back and examines the role of faith throughout the early years of this country. And he looks at the kinds of organizations that de Tocqueville discovered when he came here in the 1830s and described their brilliant vibrancy. People who had organized themselves to take care of widows and orphans, people who were providing material to people who were poor so they could make their own clothes, people who were taking in children who had been abandoned. Now, de Tocqueville chronicled these successes, and Marvin Olasky did as well, and went through the dusty tomes in the Library of Congress to find those examples that really reflected this vibrancy of the American soul. Now, Tocqueville found that there is something that is ignited in the human soul in serving others. He says even if it does not promote virtue directly, it promotes the habits of virtue that change the human heart, and that is part of what had made America good and virtuous. George Bush learned this lesson well, and in fact, when he wanted to create the faith-based initiative, it was to promote these little cells of civil society. He understood that from his tutor Olasky, but he also had seen it on the ground in Texas. Now, what the president has done in the meantime through the faith-based initiative is a number of things that have not yet been addressed. Yes, there have been legislative attempts. Yes, there have been executive orders to set up 10 offices of faith-based initiatives in 10 different branches of government. But I think the most important legacy that's going to remain from his tenure in office is that he has raised the visibility of what these faith-based organizations have done. Every city he has gone to, he has put an arm around one of these unsung heroes, one of these street saints, and has been photographed with them. He has validated their work. And even for those that will never receive government funding because they don't even want to apply, he has said what you are doing has civic value. You are valuable contributors to what the American soul is. He has used the bully pulpit, I think, in a very effective way to say faith does have a rightful place in the public square. But we need to be clear about the parameters. What faith can do may not be funded by government in its fullest force. Think about this. The role of faith is to change the human heart. The government can provide the secular piece of what a faith-based group. It may not provide the faith content. You may not use government money to purchase religious materials, to involve yourself in religious instruction. They can provide the space, they can provide the legitimacy, but they cannot provide the content. George Bush knows that, but what he has done is promoted what the government can do, which is to acknowledge their legitimacy, and in some cases allow faith-based providers to compete for contracts to provide social services on the same basis as any other secular organization. And that has been accomplished largely by executive order. But the other piece of it, the private piece of it, is the piece that he has simply legitimized through the bully pulpit, and it's been very effective. One of the things that Governor Bush, I think, has done, now President Bush, is to raise the visibility of these unsung heroes. And to the extent that he has acknowledged that there is a rightful intersection of the private and public sector, he's allowed us to think differently about what that partnership looks like. You see, there is a rightful place for mentors from churches to go into public schools to mentor children, and that's happening now. Kids Hope USA has 3,800 children throughout the United States. It's a program that began here in Michigan. The government is not a part of that. However, the government has said it is legitimate for people of faith to take, because of their faith, to go in and be a presence of love in these public schools. Their job is not to evangelize children, it's to love them and teach them how to read. That is a legitimate interaction of the private sector because it's motivated by faith, going into the public space and doing what they do, which is to love children. Do you see the intersection? These prisons that are now being set up in several other states are providing the public prison and the faith content from the private sector to change the hearts within it. The drug treatment programs like Teen Challenge and Victory Fellowship will never receive government funding unless it's through an indirect voucher. For example, if a drug addict wishes to go and receive treatment there, they may choose among various providers. But the faith content of what is being preserved is now legitimate because it's been raised in the public visibility. It's been acknowledged as knitting up the tattered fabric of civil society. Let me leave you with one story about George Bush. When he went to the Interchange Freedom Initiative in Texas as governor, he was there with prisoners, and he put his arm around one of the prisoners there and said they were singing Amazing Grace. The president was singing along. He said it was a day it kind of moved his spirit to participate in that way. 6 years later, fast forward, George Bush is in the Oval Office. He goes out into the Roosevelt room to meet a group of people who are coming in from prison fellowship. Well, one of the men was the same man that he had had his arm around. So here is this man who's been released from prison, wearing his suit, greeting the President of the United States in the Roosevelt room, and meeting him as a brother. George puts his arm around him again and says, "I understand the power of faith." You see, this is a man whose heart had also been changed by that same amazing grace. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Gleaves Whitney, too. A very packed session, a very exciting session. So, Gleaves?
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. All the panelists I thought were very stimulating and insightful, and really appreciate all of their observations as we carry this discussion further on religion and the presidency and the role between the two. And right now, we're on a very tight schedule. I just wanted to alert you, housekeeping-wise, there's a lot of food in the back there, just outside those doors, and grab a plate and the food, and tables are set up over in the room next door over here. And we're going to try to stay on schedule. Now, we have a real special treat here for lunch. It's going to be with, our lunch is going to be with H.L. Mencken. And if you've not heard H.L. Mencken, you are in for a real treat. The whole tone of this conference is going to change in about 20 minutes. So I think you'll see there are going to be some people who are going to be dissed, and it's going to get raucous, I think, at points. But with that, let's adjourn and go to lunch and have lunch with H.L. Mencken. Thank you very much. We'll come back at 12:30 for our final panel.